Good evening, and welcome to the Ford Hall Forum. My name is Wendy Ballinger, and I'm a member of the Forum's Board of Directors, and I am very pleased to have the chance to serve as moderator for this evening's program. Before I introduce our speaker, I wanted to take just a moment to tell those of you who may be joining us for the first time a little bit about the Ford Hall Forum. We are the nation's oldest ongoing public lecture series. And usually when we talk about the Forum, we stress the word oldest to make certain you know about our history and that we're approaching our 100th anniversary. I prefer, however, to stress the word public when I describe the Forum. Today, finding a lecture for free on almost any subject couldn't be easier. Colleges, libraries, museums, and interest groups of all sorts all have their own lecture series. But each of these institutions, as well as radio, broadcast, and cable television, all serve a master beyond free and open debate, whether it's their collection of books or paintings, or the education of young or not so young minds, or the corporations which provide their advertising dollars. They all have another agenda. And this means that there are some speakers who are simply too controversial for them to give them the stage. I was not thinking of tonight's program when I wrote that, I have to say. The Ford Hall Forum has only one mission: to provide open and spirited public debate. Through our history, this has meant we would give a stage to speakers that others would or could not. When Margaret Sanger wanted to come to Boston to speak about family planning, a judge issued an injunction barring her from speaking. Unfortunately for him, he didn't bar her speech, and she sat, her mouth covered with tape, on our stage while Arthur Schlesinger read her words. In the 1960s, Malcolm X was considered too dangerous to be given a public podium in the heart of Boston, outside the black community, except at the Ford Hall Forum. And in the early 1990s, when former KKK leader David Duke was nearly elected to the United States Senate, the Forum brought him to Boston to answer questions from our audience and to face them. From Robert Frost to W.E.B. Du Bois and from Al Gore to Ayn Rand, the Forum brings speakers to our stage who inform, educate, and occasionally outrage you, our audience. The point of this is not that we try to be controversial, but just that we have been and remain the only lecture series in this community dedicated to one purpose and one purpose alone: freedom of speech. I hope you will think... Thank you. It's a wonderful line for which to hear applause. If this is a value you share, I hope you will consider joining the Forum tonight. It's only through memberships that we have been able to keep this remarkable institution going for more than 100 years. And now, I want to introduce the speaker that you all came to hear. With his speech tonight, Dr. Yaron Brook becomes the latest in a series of objectivist thinkers to appear at the Ford Hall Forum. The first was Ayn Rand herself in 1961, speaking on the topic, "The Intellectual Bankruptcy of Our Age." Her appearances with us continued for 2 decades, and after her death, Dr. Leonard Peikoff joined our roster of speakers, applying the tenets of objectivism to many of society's most troublesome issues. That tradition continues tonight. Dr. Yaron Brook is the president and executive director of the Ayn Rand Institute. He is both a recognized expert on objectivism and a scholar in the area of Middle East and U.S. foreign policy. Dr. Brook is a frequent guest on and contributor to news and public affairs programs, including those on CNN, CNBC, and Fox News. He has taught and written extensively about the conflict in the Middle East, terrorism, American foreign policy, international finance and banking, and a host of related topics. In addition to his scholarly work, Dr. Brook is a former member of Israeli Army Intelligence, an entrepreneur, and a former assistant professor of finance at Santa Clara University. At the end of his address, there will be an equal amount of time for the audience to ask questions of our speaker. I would ask that everyone in the audience please hold any remarks or applause until the end of his speech. Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Yaron Brook. Dr. Brook. Gentlemen, 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 this is a free speech forum. No, sit. Please stay in your seats. I can't cut him off time. Sir, sir. Wait, just let him go. So, thank you. Thank you. So, no. No, that is not. Is that? My apologies. My hope, Tony, am I live? My hope is that that's the end of any disruption for this evening. If there is any further disruption, we will stop the program again, and the disruptors will be asked to leave and removed if they don't choose to go. You will not stop this program because freedom of speech is too important. You will only succeed in delaying it. So if there's anyone else here who intends to disrupt the program, I'd ask you to leave now. Thank you. Dr. Brook.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you to the Fort Hall Forum. It is a real honor and a pleasure to be here tonight. Hopefully we'll have a quiet evening for the rest of the evening. This is quite a venue. This is really gorgeous. So thank you, and thank you all for coming. It is 5 years since September 11th, and the daily news about the war is depressing. But about a year ago, many people were euphoric with hope. They were swept up in the excitement of the government's new strategy in the Middle East. We saw an early milestone of the strategy in January of 2005. We saw the images of smiling Iraqis displaying their ink-stained fingers, having just cast their vote in elections and liberated Iraq. Those images, people said, symbolized a momentous development. Even opponents of Bush were swept up. A New York Times editorial, for example, declared that the first 3 months of 2005 had been full of, quote, heartening surprises, each one remarkable in itself, and taken together, truly astonishing. The Bush administration is entitled to claim a healthy share of the credit for many of these advances, unquote. Commentators saw reason to believe Bush's prediction of 2003, when he declared, quote, Iraqi democracy will succeed. It would be a watershed event in the global democratic revolution. We all heard breathless news reports about a wave of democracy in the Middle East. Indeed, at the Arab League meeting in Tunis, heads of state, quote, promised to promote democracy, expand popular participation in politics, and reinforce women's rights in civil society. The upshot of all of this, we were told, would be greater security for America. The crusade to democratize the Middle East was premised on the idea, to quote Bush, the security of our nation depends on the advance of liberty in other nations, unquote. Now, this is Bush's forward strategy of freedom. The strategy calls for bringing democracy to other countries for the alleged purpose of making America safer. The notion is that democratic nations are peaceful. They do not start wars. Now, indeed, this sounds plausible. Truly free nations have no interest in waging war, except in self-defense. Free nations Free nations prosper through trade, not conquest or plunder. It is also true that the more free countries there are in the world, the better off we are. So has the strategy moved us towards peace and freedom in the Middle East? There have been elections. But who won? The elections in Iraq were touted as an American victory. But the new Iraqi government is dominated by a Shiite alliance led by SCIRI, the Supreme Council for an Islamic Revolution in Iraq. The alliance, whose spiritual leader is Ayatollah Sistani, has intimate ties with the first nation to undergo an Islamic revolution, Iran. The fundamental principle of Iraq's new constitution is Islam. And one of the most powerful men in Iraqi politics is the very popular warlord, Muqtada al-Sadr. He controls 32 seats, the largest block of seats in Iraq's parliament. And he is fiercely anti-American, pro-Iranian, and pro-theocracy. Iraq has become what it never was before, a hotbed of Islamic, Shiite, and Sunni terrorists. Or consider the Palestinian authorities, Palestinian territories. For years, Bush has begged Palestinians to elect, quote, new leaders, not compromised by terror. And finally, in the elections of January 2006, the Palestinians did turn their backs on the cronies of Yasser Arafat. They elected even more militant killers, the Hamas, an Islamist group notorious for suicide bombings. It won a landslide and now rules the Palestinian territories. This summer, the Iranian-backed Hamas and Hezbollah kidnapped and killed Israeli soldiers and precipitated a war in the region. Hezbollah, remember, took part in U.S.-endorsed elections in Lebanon and for the first time became part of Lebanon's government. They actually have two ministries. Consider as a final example of the trend the election in Egypt, in the Arab world's most populous country. Which group scored major gains? The Muslim Brotherhood, whose offshoots include Hamas and parts of Al-Qaeda. The group's founding credo is, quote, Allah is our goal, the Quran is our constitution, the Prophet is our leader, struggle is our way, and death in the path of Allah is our greatest aspiration, unquote. The Brotherhood's success was considerable. It won about 20% of the seats in Egypt's assembly, becoming the largest opposition bloc that that body has ever had. All this despite government interference at the polls. The Brotherhood would have won even more power without that interference. The Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Lebanon's Hezbollah, the Islamist regime in Iran, Al-Qaeda, these are all parts of an ideological movement, Islamic totalitarianism. This movement seeks to enslave the entire Middle East and then the rest of the world under a totalitarian state ruled by Islamic law. The totalitarians will use any means to achieve their goal. Terrorism, if it proves to be effective. All-out war, if they can win. And politics, if it can bring them power over whole countries. And the totalitarians are encouraged. By its promotion of elections, Bush's forward strategy has paved the road for Islamists to grab political power. Across the Middle East, the totalitarians have a renewed sense of purpose. Hezbollah's war against Israel this summer is one major symptom of their confidence. The situation today is worse for America than it was right after 9/11. Deadly attacks have continued. Among many attacks, remember the suicide bombings in London last year. 4 Islamists blew themselves up on underground trains. It was a bloodbath. Remember the train bombing in Madrid in 2004. Remember the countless plots that were foiled, like the recent plot to blow up airliners crossing the Atlantic. Americans are not safer. The issue now is not if there will be another catastrophic attack, but only when. Iraq is a disaster. The situation in the greater Middle East is worsening. People have lost confidence in Bush's forward strategy. What went wrong? Well, the so-called realists in foreign policy argue the forward strategy was hopeless from the start. The strategy, they say, is idealistic and therefore impractical. They add that it is not America's job to judge other regimes. To be practical, they claim, we should broker diplomatic deals with anyone at any cost, regardless of whether they are dictatorships or free nations. But history demonstrates that appeasing and cozying up with hostile regimes is a suicidal strategy. Other observers, accepting the ideal of spreading democracy, criticize the application of the strategy. For example, they claim, we didn't send enough troops to Iraq. There were not enough guards along the Iraqi border with Syria. Iraqi police forces got insufficient training, etc., etc. There are lots of these. These critics focus on the concrete means of the strategy. But the problem, in my view, is the goal driving the strategy. The strategy had to fail, not because it is idealistic, but because of the particular ideal that it ultimately advances. That ideal, we will see, is corrupt. My thesis tonight is that this strategy could not make us safer, because making us safer was never its real purpose. So let us begin our examination of my thesis with the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Suppose that on September 12th, Bush's strategist had asked this question: what must America do to defend itself against the lethal threat of Islamic terrorism? What steps are necessary to protect our lives? Well, the rational answer is America must defeat the enemy. Defeating the enemy entails the permanent elimination of the threat, the complete restoration of the protection of individual rights in America, the return to normal life without endless terror alerts and the dread of another 9/11. Now, this is the objective meaning of success in war, the return to normal life. The threat is over. Recall, for example, our last successful war, World War II. The Allied powers fought to defend themselves. Their goal was to defeat the enemy. Their combat achieved victory over Japan and Germany and restored peace. By 1945, when the war ended, the Germans and Japanese were defeated. People in the West returned to their normal lives. The threat was over. How was such a victory accomplished? The Allied powers committed themselves to crushing the enemy. They understood that the enemy was Nazism and Japanese imperialism, and that the political manifestations of these ideologies had to be stopped. The Allied powers also understood, at least in some terms, that merely assassinating Hitler or the Japanese emperor would not be enough, because the people of Germany and Japan supported the goals of their regime. Remember, Hitler was elected democratically. Crushing the Nazis required stopping the German war machine and demoralizing the supporters of the war. This is why the Allies carpet-bombed German cities, pulverized its factories and railroads, devastated its infrastructure. As Winston Churchill explained, quote, the severe, the ruthless bombing of Germany on an ever-increasing scale will not only cripple her war effort, but will create conditions intolerable to the mass of the German population, unquote. Crushing Germany demonstrated that the Nazi cause was doomed and made the many supporters of Nazism personally feel the pain of war. Likewise with Japan. the United States firebombed Japanese cities. On one day of particular fierce combat, U.S. forces dropped 500-pound firebombs over Tokyo every 50 feet. Over 80,000 Japanese died that day. About 267,000 buildings were destroyed, 1 million homeless. Yet to thoroughly defeat Japan, ultimately, the U.S. had to drop 2 nuclear bombs. Those bombs killed thousands of Japanese. The bombs demonstrated that if Japan continued threatening America, thousands more Japanese would suffer and die. The bombs, it is worth remembering, spared the lives of probably hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops who would otherwise have died in continued fighting. Germans and Japanese were made to see that supporting the political expression of Nazism and imperialism would result in mass destruction to their homes, to their factories, to themselves, to their families. They would die. They were defeated, they were demoralized, and they gave up. Today, American self-defense requires the same kind of military action. Our enemy today is the ideology of Islamic totalitarianism. As the Nazis sought to dominate Europe and then the world, so the Islamist movement seeks to subjugate the West under a borderless Islamic regime. The supposedly faceless, stateless terrorists are part of the totalitarian movement. They fight for the political vision of Islamic domination. They are inspired to fight and able to kill because they are armed and inspired by regimes that back this movement. Islamic totalitarianism has political representation in Saudi Arabia and Iran, as well as in various political and military organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, etc. Following the successful model of World War II, victory today entails smashing regimes that provide logistical and moral support for Islamic totalitarianism. And as in World War II, victory entails making the supporters of the totalitarian ideology suffer the pain of war. The Islamic warriors are able to train, to buy arms, to hide their explosives, to plan their attacks, only because many Muslims agree with their goals. These supporters of jihad against the West, who cheer when Americans die, who protect, support, and encourage the terrorists coming to kill our children. These supporters must learn that the inevitable outcome of their aggression is their own destruction. They must be made to abandon all hope of achieving the ideal of a global Islamic regime. They must see any action towards that goal as suicidal. Now, there are tactical options in prosecuting such a war, but such a war is necessary to defeat the enemy and end the threat to our lives. Victory in the war on Islamic totalitarianism requires no less than it did in World War II. It requires the destruction and demoralization of the enemy. But at no point has Bush been prepared to inflict serious damage on our enemies in the Middle East. Not even in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Such a self-assertive war was deemed unthinkable. Bush insisted that we have no quarrel with ordinary Iraqis or Afghans, only with their leaders. What alternative did the Bush administration offer? Well, the forward strategy of freedom. The plan was to replace the Taliban and Saddam Hussein with democratic regimes. Then somehow democracy would flower throughout the Middle East, and then supposedly we would all be safer. President Bush claimed that, quote, "We're advancing our security at home by advancing the cause of freedom across the world, because in the long run, the only way to defeat the terrorists is to defeat their dark vision of hatred and fear by offering the hopeful alternative of human freedom. The security of our nation depends on the advance of liberty in other nations, unquote. And what this essentially means is that we have two options. We can bring elections to poor Iraqis and be safe, or we don't spread democracy and we will be attacked. Either we bring them democracy or they destroy us with more attacks like 9/11. That's the choice. Imagine that this had been the strategy in World War II. Imagine that instead of fighting the enemy until its unconditional surrender, we somehow deposed Hitler and the Emperor of Japan and then set up elections for the liberated people. What do you think would have happened? Why would they not have elected another Hitler? Now, because this was not the approach taken, World War II was won decisively within 4 years after Pearl Harbor. We are entering the 6th year of this war, and there is no end in sight. Things are indeed getting worse. Bush's strategy rejects the goal of defeating the enemy. The strategy cannot protect us because it leaves the enemy undefeated. The enemy is encouraged to believe that its ideal is more viable than ever before. But maybe the strategy was okay, but just honestly mistaken about who would win the elections. You know, Bush hoped to see pro-democracy, pro-American leaders win in the Middle East. But could such leaders be elected in a culture that is dominated by primitive tribalism, by mysticism, by resentment towards any ideas that challenge Islam? The widespread contempt for individualism is apparent in the deep-seated worship of the family, the clan, the tribe, the group. Its members will kill to preserve family honor. Brothers will murder a sister, merely suspected of disgracing the family name. The contempt for reason is apparent in the resentment to any ideas challenging Islam. Recall the brutal response 17 years ago to the Satanic Verses, a novel by Salman Rushdie that allegedly insulted Islam. Very few, if any, Muslims bothered to read the book, to judge it firsthand, but they demanded Rushdie be executed. And of course, the Danish cartoons is another example of this. Most Muslims in the Middle East love neither freedom nor America. To believe otherwise is to evade the dancing Palestinians, Egyptians, Iraqis who celebrated the collapse of the Twin Towers. It is to evade the overwhelming anti-Americanism in the region. Given the opportunity, it is clear who they would have voted into political office. But the administration wanted to believe that Iraqis are just like freedom-loving Americans, except for the misfortune of living under a dictator. The idea that liberated Iraqis would embrace Western values with open arms, that idea is pure fantasy. It was wishful thinking in defiance of reality. This evasion was used to sell the notion that defeating the enemy was unnecessary. We just needed to topple Saddam and deliver the ballot boxes. But the results of the elections have exposed this idea for the fantasy it always was. Given the opportunity, a majority of Muslims in the Middle East elected to office our worst enemies, the Islamists. So was Bush seeking U.S. self-defense but honestly mistaken about who would win the elections? No. This was an evasion, a willful negation of the facts. Indeed, now that the election results are in, has the administration repudiated the strategy? Absolutely not. The forward strategy is not an alternate means of achieving victory, because victory is not its purpose. It is a substitute for defeating the enemy. So if it cannot bring us victory, why was it embraced? What is the ultimate goal of the forward strategy, if not victory? Now, to answer that, let's begin by considering the nature of the strategy. It is called the forward strategy of freedom. But this is a vicious fraud. It has nothing to do with freedom. In reality, it is the forward strategy of democracy. of unlimited majority rule. Now, there is a fundamental and I think revealing difference between advocating for freedom and for democracy. Now, what is freedom? In a political context, it means the absence of physical coercion. It is a profound value because in order to eat and earn a living, to build cars and perform surgery, in order to live, man must think and act on the judgment of his own rational mind. To do that, man must be left alone, left free from the interference of the government and of other men. Freedom is premised on the individual's moral right to exist and his right to pursue his happiness. That right also includes self-defense. To defend us from criminals, we have the police. To defend a nation from foreign aggressors, we have the military. To fight a war for U.S. self-defense means to defend the individual freedom of each American. It means securing the right of each American to live free from the threat of foreign aggression. The Founding Fathers recognized that freedom rests on the individual's right to life and happiness. That's why they created a constitutional republic, protecting individual rights, the rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. Our constitutional framework prohibits the majority of voting away the rights of anyone. The founders firmly rejected democracy. Democracy is not freedom, but literally unlimited majority rule. Under democracy, the rights of the individual are not paramount. The desires of the group, the majority, are supreme. If your gang is large enough, you can get away with whatever you want, sacrificing the life and wealth of whoever stands in your way. Now, this is a form of tyranny. It puts the wishes of the majority first, above the individual, above all else. Now, this is the corrupt political ideal that this administration is trying to bring to the Middle East. This strategy puts the whims of Iraqi and Afghan mobs first. The strategy is to politically empower Muslims of the region to assert their desires, their wishes. As we've seen, this clearly subverts U.S. security. If one's goal were to achieve U.S. self-defense, then we would decide the political makeup of a defeated regime, how it is made permanently non-threatening to us. But Washington disavowed any intention of deciding this issue. Bush proclaimed all along that America would never determine the precise character of Iraq's new regime. The decision was entirely theirs. Whatever the Iraqis chose, America would endorse. One scenario is that elections might bring to power an Iranian-style militant theocracy in Iraq. When asked if the U.S. would accept such a result, Bush said, yes. Why should America sit back and accept a new hostile regime in Iraq? A worse threat to our security than Saddam Hussein was? Because, Bush explained, quote, democracy is democracy. Now, this is what the forward strategy seeks, to make the will of the Iraqis, of our enemies, paramount. Now, to see how seriously Washington takes this, let's see how they conducted the war. From the outset, the war was pitched as a war of liberation. Just as we toppled the Taliban to liberate the Afghans, so we toppled Saddam to liberate the Iraqis. The campaign in Iraq, after all, was called Operation Iraqi Freedom, not Operation Secure America. Shock and awe, the supposedly merciless bombing of Baghdad never materialized. That's because, as Washington demanded, the military's goal was not to devastate Iraq's infrastructure, but to provide welfare services. Bush had promised that America will, quote, stand ready to help the citizens of a liberated Iraq. We will deliver medicine to the sick, and we are now moving into place nearly 3 million emergency rations to feed the hungry, unquote. The fighting was hardly begun when Washington launched the so-called Reconstruction. Our military was ordered to commit troops and resources, which were needed to protect our own personnel, to the tasks of reopening schools, printing textbooks, fixing up hospitals. For the Iraqis, Washington laid on food and medicine. It opened schools and sewers, but it tied the hands of our military. Washington commanded the military tiptoe around Iraq. Troops were coached in all manner of cultural sensitivity training, so they would not offend the customs of the locals. The welfare of Iraqis was placed above the lives of our soldiers, who were put in the line of fire but prevented from using all the necessary force necessary to win. U.S. troops died as a result. Washington treats the lives of our military personnel as expendable. Their blood is spilled for the sake of serving Iraqis, a people overwhelmingly hostile to America. Bush had committed America to this selfless mission in the run-up to the war. Speaking in early 2003, he said, quote, "The first to benefit from a free Iraq would be the Iraqi people themselves. They live in scarcity and fear under a dictator who has brought them nothing but war and misery and torture. Their lives and freedom matter little to Saddam Hussein, but Iraqi lives and freedom matter greatly to us," unquote. And their lives did matter greatly to Washington. They mattered far more than the lives of security of Americans. The forward strategy dictates that we serve the needs of Iraqis for food, medicine, textbooks. It demands that we bring them elections, even if it means the death of our troops. It demands all this with the open admission that elections could empower our worst enemies. The horrendous disaster in Iraq is more than most Americans can stomach. But Bush and other advocates of the strategy believe that Iraq should be just the beginning. America, he has stated, is, quote, "committed to an historical long-term goal, to secure the peace of the world. We seek the end of tyranny in our world," unquote. This global crusade for democracy is allegedly America's destiny. For Bush, this is a religious mission that God has conferred upon us. Quote, "History has an author who fills time and eternity with his purpose. We did not ask for this mission, yet there is honor in history's call. It is the calling of our time," unquote. What would such a campaign mean in practical terms, given the nightmare that Iraq has become? Well, hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops have fought in the war since 9/11. In Iraq, at the peak, as many as 300,000 of our military were involved. Nearly 140,000 troops are stuck in the quagmire there today. The war effort since 9/11 has cost us about $370 billion, with Iraq costing about $260 billion. About 2,700 Americans have come home from Iraq dead in body bags. Nearly 20,000 have come home burned, blinded, and limping. The casualties of the war are largely unseen, but they are real. And for what? What are the democracy crusaders calling for? It is not just one nightmare like Iraq, which is awful in itself, but dozens of conflicts that grind up American troops and drain our nation's lifeblood. Not for a few months, but indefinitely, as we fulfill the open-ended calling of our time. Now, this is morally obscene. Now, why are advocates of the forward strategy so committed to spreading democracy? Notice that Bush and other advocates believe that assertively pursuing U.S. self-defense is somewhat illegitimate. To them, it is unimaginable that America would fight a war against Islamic totalitarianism with the intensity and righteousness that we did 60 years ago against Germany and Japan. It is unimaginable that the U.S. would seek to demoralize the enemy, that we would, as Churchill put it, quote, create conditions intolerable to the mass of the enemy population, unquote. It is unimaginable that the U.S. would seek victory for its own self-defense. All this is off the table. It is not the goal of the strategy. But notice that Bush and others believe it is legitimate to shed U.S. blood for the sake of others, to send young American men to risk their lives and die so we can bring ignorant, hostile Iraqis the vote. Advocates of the strategy dispense with the goal of defending America and instead doggedly promote democracy, even as they admit that that might make us less safe. They regard this as noble, as virtuous. But why? Why do they regard promoting democracy as legitimate but self-defense as illegitimate? Now, the answer lies in a certain moral code. Advocates of the forward strategy are guided by their moral principles. The implicit principle that shapes their thinking is this: selfless service to others is good, but pursuing values for your own benefit is evil. This is the morality that holds self-sacrifice as a virtue. This is the same moral code that dominates our culture. From secular and religious authorities, left and right, we are urged that to be moral is to give up our values selflessly to others. Put other people first, we are told, and don't be selfish. According to this creed, Mother Teresa is a moral hero, but a productive businessman like Bill Gates is not. Well, unless he repents by giving away his billions. Whom must we serve? Well, whoever is needy, whoever lacks a value like liberty or wealth. And on this standard, the oppressed, impoverished, primitive Iraqis are definitely have-nots. They have no food, no electricity, no freedom, nothing. But isn't this self-destructive? Doesn't this contradict the needs of U.S. security? Yes, it certainly does. And that is partly why it is supposedly noble. As Bush has stated, we Americans know how to, quote, sacrifice for the liberty of strangers, unquote. Now, sacrifice is universally misunderstood. It does not mean giving up something trivial for the sake of a big reward at the end, like saving up money today in order to buy a car next year. To sacrifice means to give up a value for the sake of a lesser or a non-value. Sacrifice means renouncing benefits now, but for no greater benefit. It means saving up money today and handing it over to a stranger. It means sending American soldiers to Iraq not to defend their own liberty and ours, but to ensure Iraqis have functioning sewers. It means a net loss to us. The cardinal value that America must sacrifice is its own national security, the defense of our lives from Islamic terrorists. On this moral code, we have no right to exist or to defend our freedom. Our duty is to renounce our own interest, our rightful need for security, and instead sacrifice for strangers all across the globe, wherever tyranny rules. The democracy crusade is driven by the morality of self-sacrifice, the moral code of altruism. Ultimately, amazingly well organized.
They actually have nice voices there.
And they have beautiful voices, which is bizarre.
A benefit. The police are right outside, so they're only here just a second. And I assume you have an extra 10 minutes because I will extend the program by 10 minutes. Is that?
I don't know how much of that. Whatever I finish. Oh yeah, I'll stay as long. Sure. Please.
I always try to make up.
That's not good. That's not good.
It's the police's job.
at Tufts, on Friday. I spoke at Tufts. And at the end of my talk, they stood in the back of their stand and amazing birds. Beautiful, calming.
This is not a time for comments. This is a presentation. There will be question and answers, and if they can be presented civilly, you're welcome to stay. If not, please leave now. Please leave now if you can't be civil. Ladies and gentlemen, we will extend the program. None of this will stop anyone's right to speak. There is a difference between freedom of speech and disruption. I would ask you, if you are not involved in this, to please take your seats. It gets very difficult for us to tell who's disrupting and who's not if you're standing up in the aisles. So if you're planning to stay and ask questions civilly, please take your seats. Anyone who disrupts this event will be removed, because that is not evidence of freedom of speech.
Thank you. They have good voices. It's really a shame that the democracy crusade is driven by the morality of self-sacrifice, the morality of altruism. Ultimately, the goal of the crusade is not to end the threats arrayed against us, but to bring unearned benefits to our enemies. The forward strategy logically fits with the general approach to foreign policy. Although there is a shortage, for example, there's a shortage of military recruits, U.S. troops remained as so-called peacekeepers in dozens of countries where no U.S. interest is at stake. They remain for the sake of strangers. Moreover, America funnels huge amounts of money in foreign aid. Recall the U.S. response to last year's terrorist attacks in London. It was not a commitment to destroy the enemy that it struck. At the G8 meeting, held at the same time as the attack happened, the G8 meeting was held in Scotland, Bush held a press conference in which he pledged to ramp up American foreign aid, promising $50 billion to the poor and oppressed of Africa and the Middle East. But Americans are not yet a people who respond favorably to blatant calls of self-sacrifice. They expect some benefit at the end. That is why self-sacrificial policies are almost always packaged with a deceptive veneer. The veneer makes them seem like sensible, practical, self-interested policies. This is why Bush insists that helping Iraqis is both, quote, the morally right thing to do and in our own national interest, unquote. But you cannot escape the consequences of self-sacrifice. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. You cannot sacrifice your military for strangers and be stronger in the face of threats. This contradiction is inevitable and becomes harder to ignore as more Americans are slaughtered in Iraq. Notice how Bush continues to voice tough-sounding rhetoric, how he strives to present his strategy as necessary for American interests. This is meant to reinforce the crumbling veneer. It is meant to fool Americans and to help Bush and the advocates of the strategy fool themselves. They believe their own contradictions. The need to slap a deceptive veneer of self-sacrifice on self-sacrifice also explains why Muslims in the Middle East were portrayed as freedom-loving friends of America. It is easier to persuade oneself and others to sacrifice for a friendly, freedom-loving neighbor than to sacrifice American lives for the enemy. The attempt to present self-sacrifice as beneficial permeates the forward strategy. Thus, we are told that squandering $50 billion on Africa and the Middle East will somehow triumph over terrorism, as Tony Blair and Bush did in the G8 meeting. But it cannot. We are told that sacrificing U.S. wealth and lives to bring democracy to others will somehow make us safer. But it cannot. We are told that a worldwide crusade to end tyranny, a global forward strategy, will somehow advance our moral calling and destiny as a nation. But this is absurd. It is nothing but crude nationalism of the kind spouted by fascists in the last century. America is the land of free, sovereign individuals. Americans are master of their own life, not slaves to their nation or some mystical destiny. The deceptive veneer of the forward strategy has fooled many people, but the results of the strategy are unmistakable. The strategy is self-destructive. It is a disaster because it is a faithful application of the morality of self-sacrifice. The forward strategy is suicide. Absurdly, after 5 years of war, America now faces a threat that we helped make stronger, more dangerous. This is precisely what the forward strategy must lead to, given its moral premises, and what its promoters evade. This strategy means sacrificing American lives, not merely for the sake of indifferent strangers, but for the sake of the enemy. And it teaches our enemies a profoundly encouraging lesson, that America will not seek victory. It does not stand for its own interests, but renounces them on principle. America is a paper tiger. Note Iran's glee at the events and how emboldened Iran feels. Morally, the forward strategy of freedom is irredeemable. It is self-destructive because it is an expression of the morality of self-sacrifice. That is what dooms it. A strategy for victory needs to be based on a radically different moral principle. The moral principle on which true freedom rests. The principle that each individual has an inalienable right to his life, to the pursuit of his happiness. A strategy of real freedom, a strategy for victory, must be based on Ayn Rand's morality of rational self-interest. Such a strategy is committed to defeating the enemy because its premise is that man has a moral right to his own existence and that it is the government's obligation to protect the rights of its citizens. This strategy is pro-freedom, the freedom of Americans to live unmolested and unharmed by foreign powers. A strategy for victory is practical and idealistic. It is a strategy committed to protecting American lives, not merely in the range of the moment or in a given crisis, but across the span of decades and in every single situation on principle. It is a strategy that advocates for freedom, real freedom, not majority rule. It is a strategy that provides support, primarily moral support, to real freedom fighters. To achieve victory in this war over Islamic totalitarianism, we need to wage as fierce and assertive a war as we did 6 decades ago. Victory entails pounding the enemy until we crush its ability to fight and until we demoralize its supporters. Our security requires stopping Islamists from implementing their ideal of Islamic world domination. Jihadists are willing to kill and die for that ideal, but they will not dare pursue it if they know it is unachievable, that it is a lost cause. To accomplish this, we must end the regimes in Iran and Saudi Arabia. These regimes are the ideological, financial, and logistical motor of the Islamic totalitarian movement. Iran, in particular, symbolizes the power of totalitarian Islam and inspires the jihadists. nearly 30 years after its Islamic revolution. Iran is now brazenly chasing nuclear weapons and threatening the world's most powerful nation. Iran makes the movement's perverse ideal seem practical and achievable. Ending Iran's regime will help break the jihadist will to fight. But if we devastate Iran, I get this question all the time, will we make new enemies in the process? Not if we do it right. Consider what happened in Japan after the U.S. victory. Quoting General Douglas MacArthur, the Japanese suddenly felt the concentrated shock of total defeat. Their whole world crumbled. It was not merely the overthrow of their military might. It was the collapse of a faith. It was the disintegration of everything they had believed in and lived by and fought for. It left a complete vacuum, morally, mentally, and physically. Unquote. That collapse, disintegration, and vacuum is essentially what we need to create among Muslims in the Middle East. If they are to be permanently non-threatening to us, the people of the region must learn that the ideas of Islamic totalitarianism will bring them nothing but devastation. What happens after the war should be determined by our rational self-interest. It might be in our interest to impose a free political system, as we did in Japan. We didn't let the Japanese elect whoever they wanted. Rather, we set the terms. But if setting up a new regime does not advance our self-defense, if it sacrifices U.S. wealth and lives, then morally we must not pursue such a course. Instead, we should leave the country in as non-threatening a condition as possible and be clear on the consequences of becoming a threat to the U.S. again. If our potential enemies know that the consequence of threatening us is their own destruction, the world will be a peaceful place for Americans. But such a strategy for victory has a crucial precondition. We cannot march into battle. We cannot drop bombs. We cannot assert our right to self-defense unless we have the moral confidence that we are in the right. We need to know clearly that it is morally proper to destroy the enemy, because America is a free nation and an innocent victim fighting in retaliation. We need to know and to declare boldly that our values of political freedom, individualism, and secular government are morally good. Having certainty in our own moral superiority over the aggressor is indispensable to the military task. What we need fundamentally is the conviction that we have an absolute right to exist and to defend our freedom. If we want to preserve our freedom, we must pursue victory over the enemy. If we want victory, we must have moral confidence. If we are to have moral confidence, we must embrace the morality of rational self-interest. We are in an ideological battle. It is a battle about the morality that guides American foreign policy. It is a battle that comes down to this: do Americans have a duty to sacrifice for strangers, or do we have a moral right to exist and pursue our individual happiness? Now, this is the battle that we must fight and win here in America if we are to be victorious. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Now is the time we open the floor for a dialogue with you, the audience. I'm going to take a minute, given the events of this evening, to lay out some ground rules. You are not required to agree with Dr. Brook. You are, however, required to be a part of this dialogue, to be civil, and to pose a question. The audience, there are many people who would like to ask questions. You need to be brief and to the point. Anyone who is not, who goes on at length, who I think is not being part of a civil dialogue, we will turn off the microphone and we will ask you to leave. I hope, however, that we can have an interesting and spirited exchange of ideas. I will call on people at the microphone, one at a time. Go ahead. Oh, sorry. There you go.
Thank you.
And Dr. Brook has agreed to extend the program a little bit to make up for some of the time we lost earlier in the evening. So we can open with our first question. Sir?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to preface that I admired your speech and agree pretty much with everything you said. However, I still have some questions, and the main one that is nagging me is, given the climate, the pervasive climate of political correctness and moral relativism, how do you convince the majority of the Americans who appear historically not to have had the guts to start a fight until there has been a calamity such as World War II to enter the fight? Because America has been isolationist traditionally. So how do you change that? Thank you.
Well, we've had the calamitous event. So I don't think even, unfortunately, I don't even believe today that if an even more calamitous event happened, the response would be different. I don't think that we, learn from experience if we are dominated by an ideology that guides us to self-sacrifice. So the only way, I think, today to bring about change is educational. I have very little hope, I'd say no hope, really, for this war to go well in the near future. I just don't see that. I think that what we need to do is awaken the self-confidence, the sense of life of the American people, and arm it with a new moral code, arm it with a new philosophy, arm it with better ideas. And the first thing you have to do in that battle is to eliminate the veneer of the strategy. That is to show the strategy for what it really is, to show what's really happening, to show that we're not fighting to win, to show that we could win easily. And then provide the moral justification, the moral reasoning for why we have a right to fight in self-defense. And I think Americans get that. My experience is when you actually present Americans with the facts, present them with ideas, they get it. They want to go out. They want to defend their own lives. If they feel threatened, they want to go get the bad guys. But first you have to explain to them that what this administration is doing is not that there is another way, that the other way is doable and has been done before, and that it is moral. It is right. Ultimately, the Americans want to do what's right. And one of the things they have to learn is that acting in your own self-defense and acting in your own self-interest is right, is good, is moral. And that's, speak up. I mean, the only way it's going to happen is if we keep speaking, if we keep educating, if we keep having events like this.
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out an irony. You talk about rational self-interest, right, and being selfish, and how, the founders of the Constitution provided that right for us. Now, don't you think it was selfless of them to put their lives on the line to do that for us? Don't you see that as an irony? And also, I wanted to ask you if you knew about how the Japanese were surrendering through the Vatican. And it was the Truman Doctrine, the Bertrand Russell Doctrine, preemptive nuclear strike, right? To put the world in fear. They were trying to strike Russia, right? I mean, did you know about that the Japanese were surrendering? Because there was no need whatsoever for Truman to bomb Nagasaki and Hiroshima. What FDR did was the most beautiful, he represented the Constitution.
Thank you. I think we have two questions from you.
I got both questions.
Thank you.
The first one's a good question. Were the Founding Fathers selfless in signing the Declaration of Independence, which took an enormous amount of courage, because they were basically, I mean, they didn't know they would win, and they certainly knew that if they would lose, they would be labeled as traitors, and they would be hung, their property destroyed, and their families destroyed. But that is not being selfless. What the Founding Fathers understood, which so few, unfortunately, people understand today, is that life as a slave, is that life as an unfree human being is not worth living when you can fight for your own freedom, when you have the opportunity to bring about your own liberation, your own freedom. What the Founding Fathers did was fight for their own lives, for their right to life, liberty, and their ability ultimately to pursue happiness. They fought for such a political system because it was in their interests and in the interest of their families, their friends, and for the interest of the people they interacted with. They wanted to live in a society, in a world, as I do, that is free. With, again, they can pursue happiness. As to your second question, second question was, yes, about the revisionist history regarding Truman and the nuclear bomb. I am not a historical expert, although there is one here in the room who knows this better than I do. But my understanding is that is just pure revisionism. Indeed, the evidence I have seen is that after the first bomb was dropped, the Japanese actually met to decide what to do at this point and decided they would not surrender because they didn't believe the U.S. had another one. And they thought that if they didn't surrender, the U.S. would still have to invade the island and they would be able to inflict millions of casualties. And their assessment of internal American politics was that the American public would not stand for that. Just the battles before Japan, and I can't remember the names exactly, but tens of thousands of Marines. There's a movie now on Iwo Jima's where 25,000 Marines died in one battle that lasted a couple of weeks. Their estimation that the American public was fed up with the war and that they could cut a deal with the Americans if they just hung on long enough. It took the second bomb to convince them that America had not lost its will to fight and that they would be devastated. I mean, they were already devastated, but they would be devastated even more, that they would lose everything that they had if they did not surrender unconditionally immediately. So that is my understanding of the history, and I've yet to see any evidence that that is not true.
Sir.
Thank you. Good day. I'm somewhat of a follower of yours and also of Ayn Rand's. I'd like to situate my question in a hypothetical. Just to do her justice. So say we did engage in a nuclear attack on Iran, and this invoked, say we didn't do it right, and this invoked a World War III type situation with Russia, China, India, etc., and you created a set of circumstances where the only two people on the planet standing on a pile of nuclear debris was you and George Shultz. Do you think he would use lubricant when he was sodomizing you?
Sir.
Because I doubt it.
Sir.
He likes it somewhat rough.
Sir, sorry, you've passed the bounds of good taste. Thank you.
What do you think?
Can we have the next question?
Right, next
please?
question, sir. Please take your seat
people
now.
are just disgusting.
Tony, cut the mic.
You really are.
Tony,
You're just
please
disgusting.
cut it. Thank you. Please take your seat, sir. You're accomplishing nothing at this point. Don't bother. Just stop. Sir, Tony, bring the mic back. Sir, would you like to ask your question civilly, please?
Well, I'll try to be civil, even though I don't
No,
really...
please leave. You don't need to touch it.
Okay. They said you were from the Ayn Rand Institute, but it sounds more like you're from a George Orwell Institute.
Get ready, Tony.
Okay, yeah, get ready. Nothing threatens individual freedom and democracy, or collective freedom and democracy, more than a coercive military occupation. So what can people in the Middle East and around the world do to protect themselves from Zionist terrorism and Zionist totalitarianism?
Well, what the Muslims of the Middle East could do is establish free countries, establish regimes that actually were friendly to Israel, because they've got a lot to benefit and learn from Israel. They could establish free countries that were interested in trading with Israel and with the United States. They could copy our Constitution and our principle of individual rights and set up wonderful countries throughout the Middle East, and I'd be all for that. I'm not for America occupying the Middle East, as I stated. I'm for making the Middle East non-threatening to the United States, and for Israel to make it non-threatening to it. The countries of the Middle East, many of the countries of the Middle East, are threatening the United States. They are trying to kill us. 9/11 was just one, unfortunately, I fear, small example of what they are capable of and what they will do to us if we don't stop them. So their solution is to, take the example of the Founding Fathers. Revolt against their dictatorial regimes and establish free countries.
Well,
Next question, please.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you hear me?
I think, yeah, there we go.
Okay. Yeah, I would just like to say I'm really delighted. I never, ever thought I'd have the opportunity to meet a real, live, fascist Nazi. So I would like to
ready,
thank
please.
you for that. But my question is, you spoke of freedom of speech. Now, can you enlighten the people on your audience the irony behind that, since you're working with Daniel Pipes, Fleming Rose, David Horowitz, Lynn Cheney, and the people that are running a campus Gestapo all over the nation right now? How do you have the audacity to do that?
That's a legitimate question. Because it gives me an opportunity to defend Campus Watch, which I think is a wonderful organization. Campus Watch, which as far as I know, I don't have much involvement with Campus Watch, but it is run by Daniel Pipes, is an organization that scans what is being taught in American universities, identifies things that are wrong, that are professors that distort history, that misrepresents the truth about the Middle East, the truth about what America stands for, and about American principles, and they describe that on the website, and they let students know that these are professors that, if you're interested in the truth, you should probably avoid. These are professors that misrepresent in terms of what they teach. Campus Watch does not send out, thugs to disrupt the classes of these professors. Campus Watch does not use force in order to force these professors not to be teaching what they're teaching. All they do is provide information, valuable market service to students and alma mater, some of us who might give to our alma mater, former students, about who's teaching what where, whom we should support if we care about America, if we care about the truth, and who we shouldn't support if we care about America and we care about the truth. So it is an organization dedicated to the truth, and indeed it is in doing so, it is protecting and helping free speech. It is not suppressing, it is doing exactly the opposite.
I'm going to remind those in line that the questions don't have to agree with the speaker. They must remain civil. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Dr. Or it's evening this time. Good evening, Dr. Brooks. Now, I took everything that you said into consideration, and I don't entirely agree with everything that you have to say. One thing that concerns me is you talk about escalating the violence in Iraq right now. And the thing that comes to mind is the threat of a new Cold War. Now, please, if you would, you certainly have a very large Democratic following here. Can you say a few words just to ease our worrying hearts to know that the threat of a thermonuclear confrontation with Iran in Russia and China is not in the cards, and that once we do annihilate and turn Fallujah into dust, as you told Chris Matthews the other night, can you please reassure us that everything will be well?
It was Bill O'Reilly. I want to do everything possible to prevent thermonuclear war in the Middle East. I have not advocated using nuclear weapons because I don't believe they're necessary. We are dealing with countries that are weak. We are dealing with, just compare this war to World War II. In World War II, we were fighting two mighty industrial empires, or countries. Japan was an empire, Germany was a country. Countries that were building the best fighter planes, the best tanks, the best aircraft carriers the world had ever seen until America entered the war. We were fighting countries that had tremendous resources at their disposal. They actually built the weapons they were using against us. Take a look at the countries we're fighting today. Not a single weapon used against American troops was built in any one of the countries in the Middle East. They are all imports, primarily from the West, unfortunately. They have no industry. They have no economy other than industry and economy based on oil, which is an industry that we created for them. American corporations created those industries in the 20s, 30s, and 20s through the 50s by drilling for oil, building the pipelines, building the refineries. Just an interesting fact about Iran. Do you know that Iran, which sits on the second or third largest oil reserve in the world and produces huge quantities of oil, do you know that it imports 40% of its gasoline? It imports 40% of its gasoline because they don't refine it in Iran. So they ship the oil outside of Iran, get it refined, and ship it back to Iran because they don't have the technology, the capacity to do it. We are truly dealing with countries that are still, in many respects, in the Middle Ages. They have no wealth, no economy other than that provided by oil or provided by the West. The dams were built by Western or Russian companies. The power plants, the water plants, the water treatment, the sewage was all built by Western technologies. So defeating them is not hard, it is easy. The risk of thermonuclear war is created by not doing anything, by letting the Iranians develop nuclear weapons. Because the Iranian regime will not hesitate to use them, and it won't hesitate to use them against you. Because they believe in an ideology, particularly the leaders and the two primary leaders, the supreme leader of Iran and the president, are both thorough mystics. They both believe in the coming of an Armageddon and the 12th Imam and all kinds of Shiite nonsense. They don't mind if we nuke them as part of a war because they go to heaven and there's a whole mythology about virgins and the rest of it that comes with heaven. And Armageddon comes, and it's the new world. So they will not hesitate to use nuclear weapons. I would like us to strike Iran first before they develop those nuclear weapons in order to avoid the need to use them. On the other hand, if using nuclear weapons, I'm not, on the other hand, saying we should never use them. If that is the most effective way in which to combat the threat, then we should use them. But I don't see, I like to say that if we had a General Patton, if we had a General Sherman, 3 armored divisions in about 3 weeks to 3 months, the whole conflict is over, if we're willing to fight it the right way. This is not hard. This is not rocket science. This is easy if you have the moral confidence to execute the plan.
Next question, please.
Doctor, could you elaborate a little on President Bush's personal philosophy and religious conservatives in general, and what effect it might be having on the progress of the war?
Yeah, so to elaborate on Bush's personal philosophy, his religion...
His personal religious views and religious conservatives.
I'm not an expert on Bush. I haven't read a lot about his personal philosophy, but from everything that I've read, particularly as it relates to the war, it is clear that he is heavily influenced by religion. by evangelical Christianity, and he claims to be a born-again evangelical Christian. I've read articles about the influence of evangelicals in the administration and on the administration policies, and I find the whole phenomena incredibly scary. I think that President Bush has allowed religion into politics in an unprecedented way. I don't know of any other president who has brought religion into politics and has actively promoted the erosion and the separation of church and state as much as Bush has, starting with faith-based initiatives, and in the way he talks. Again, we have a mission to end tyranny and to bring democracy to the world given to us by God. It is the calling of our time, and I don't think he means it in the sense that I think 19th century presidents talked about God. I think he really means it. I think he really is a dedicated religious person who, if he got his way, would bring in a lot more religion into politics. You can list the examples, whether it's stem cells or whether it's the morning after pill. I can't think of more examples right now, but there's a whole list of examples on how religion has entered politics and how the debate has changed in America today to the point where Democrats are competing now with Republicans on who can be more religious, because they're trying to they've assumed now that this is the way to get elected, is through religion. I think Bush's altruism comes from Christianity. I think there's some extent to which he believes that you can't be too tough, that turning the other cheek is appropriate. I also think that the fact that he is religious makes it inconceivable to him that Islam leads to violence. He doesn't see his Christianity, his faith, as leading to violence, and he can't project that onto Islam. And as a consequence, it's only recently that Islam has even entered his vocabulary, and then it's Islamic fascism, which I think is a way to secularize it. Because fascism is a secular concept. It's to marginalize them again. It's these extremists. It's these outside of the realm. It's to try to distance it as much as possible from Islam. But it's only recently that he's even done that. Immediately after September 11th, and for 3-4 years after, he talked about terrorists. There was no mention of Islam. And indeed, if you remember the Day of Prayer, immediately after September 11th, or the celebration of the Ramadan in October of 2001. A month after September 11th, there was a Ramadan fast-breaking dinner at the White House. So I think he would not acknowledge this notion that a religion, any religion, can lead to violence. And not only that, but I think it also affects his view of freedom. I think Bush, and I've read this out of Bush, and I've also read it from some of the neoconservative thinkers who support Bush. They believe that religion is essential to freedom, that freedom comes from religion. And Michael Novak has a whole book dedicated to this notion that Islam has to be for freedom. That it is truly that they just don't know it, that we just have to release this spark, and freedom will just fly through Islam, because it's some convoluted idea that if there's one God and you're dedicated to one God, that promotes personal freedom. I never got the exact logic of what, but the whole book is premised on this idea that Islam has to be consistent with freedom. It's almost like he's trying to convince himself, but that Islam, just like Christianity and Judaism, have to lead to that. And I think that's part of why they were so self-deluded about the flowers in the streets when American soldiers would arrive in Iraq, and the reception in the rest of the Arab world once we just freed up the freedom impulse among the Muslims. So religion has played a very big role in how the strategy and how everything I think Bush has done.
Ma'am?
I've been curious about something ever since I saw you speak at Tufts the other night.
Sure.
You told us there that you were an atheist, or
Yes.
you are an atheist, rather. So I guess that means that you don't believe that any one of us has a soul. But you keep talking about morality. I'm wondering what your basis for that is. How do you judge morality?
Great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think morality is a science. Morality comes from a fundamental alternative that every human being faces. It comes from the fact that all life faces an alternative between existence and non-existence, life and death, if you will. And that once human beings choose life, we do not have programmed into us how to be successful at life. Morality is about choosing values, those values that promote your life, that will enable you to live a successful and ultimately happy life. Morality is objective. It is about looking out there into reality and saying, what facts of reality, what values do I need to pursue? What things do I need in order for me to be successful in my life, in order to be happy? And if you look out, and if you look at what those things are, you find that anything from food and shelter and clothing to this wonderful building we're in and the paintings around us, so the kind of the spiritual values that you get from observing a painting, all of it comes about through the use of human reason. And therefore, human reason, observing reality, integrating the facts of reality, conceptualizing them, understanding them, thinking, is the primary value. Being rational is your primary virtue. That is how you attain life. That is how you are successful in life. And that is the fundamental value in morality. So the standard is your life, because, a plant is programmed to know exactly what to do to stay alive. It needs light, it needs water. You put a plant in a garden where there's no water at the top level. It'll send its roots down to seek water. It is pursuing its values, not consciously, not out of. We don't have that. We don't have the automatic knowledge of how to make clothes and how to build beautiful buildings and paint paintings and make cell phones and cook a great steak dinner. We have to figure all that out. We have to reason that out. And we need morality. Morality provides us with the values and the virtues aimed at preserving our life. What the plant has automatically, what an animal has automatically, we need to think through. And indeed, let me just say a word about religion. Religion to me, the notion that morality comes from religion to me is bizarre. Because what does religion say about morality? It says that somebody a long time ago talked to some entity called God, and God said X, and you're just supposed to do X. And we're all supposed to believe that. And when God changes his mind and says Y, we're supposed to do Y. It is the most, and I highly recommend, if you're really interested in this issue, I highly recommend you go to our website. There is, I think on Monday, I think tomorrow or later this week, there will be a free video, a free lecture on morality and religion by Dr. Anka Gate. On exactly this topic. It is a brilliant talk, and it'll be available free on our website, AynRand.org.
No, we can't hear you from there, and there are many other people waiting that aren't going to get a chance to ask a question, so I'm going to move on to the next questioner. Thank you. It's not up to you to judge that, I'm sorry. We're going to move on to the next question. You can get back in line in case we have time if you'd like. I suspect we won't, but you can try. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's no doubt that we're in a pretty bad situation right now. And one thing that hasn't really been discussed is the economic crisis that we're in. I mean, this housing bubble is blowing out. We have hedge funds like Amaranth that are blowing out. And I mean, this concerns me because, fascism in the 30s and 40s was directly related to certain economic measures that had to be taken, right? And if we were to go to war in the Middle East, there would be a pretty bad economic collapse. I don't know if people in this room are ready to deal with that. But, I was just wondering, are we kind of jumping the gun a little bit here, pushing for war? Isn't there a way to peacefully develop together? I mean, this actually has worked in the past.
It would be wonderful if there was. I mean, there's no question. War is not, counter to Keynesian economists and others, war is not a value added from an economic perspective. I'm not arguing to go to war in order to grow the economy. I would be happy if there was tomorrow a revolution in Iran and freedom-loving Iranians came to power and we could establish a friendly trade relationship with Iran. We'd get oil, we'd trade technology, we would build on that. But the fact is that there is no negotiating. There is no being peaceful and nice and reasonable with people dedicated to killing you and developing nuclear weapons to blow up your cities. There's nothing other than preempting that through a military strike, preempting the nuclear attack, but because they've already started the war, you could argue, I think you should argue, that the war started in 1979 when they took over the American embassy in Tehran, and then they killed many Americans in Beirut and in the Cobalt Towers and elsewhere. So the war is ongoing. It's been going on for a while. You can negotiate with killers. You don't do that domestically, and you certainly wouldn't do that from a perspective of foreign policy. Now, and I don't think a war with Iran would cost a lot of money. I mean, I'm not for Bush's policy, which is to spend $260 billion on Iraqi reconstruction. Somebody said, I think earlier today, maybe it was Peter Schwartz, that if you break it, we don't have to fix it. Or maybe it was yesterday. I don't believe that if you break it, you have to fix it, right? If we smash Iran, I don't believe we have to pour hundreds of billions of dollars into fixing it. I believe, again, we make them as unthreatening as possible. That might involve helping them establish a free country. It might not. But you make them as unthreatening as possible, and you get out of there. You don't spend hundreds of billions in reconstruction. And while I am fairly pessimistic about the U.S. economy long term, I think there are a lot of bad things going on. I'll just answer your other question kind of quickly. A collapse is not imminent.
Next question, please.
I guess the outcome of the war in Iraq was obviously devastational, or a failure, as you say. It's been concluded that we launched this war without the basis of any military threat against our nation. And the idea to me of the mass murder, the mass death of, I guess, hundreds of thousands of people right now, civilians in Iran, when we face no active military threat against us, is really abandoning the tradition of the United States. And to me, absolutely disgusting. And I would just say, if there's anybody in the audience that has any of the humanity left in them, really challenge the underlying axioms upon which this man's speaking, because he really hasn't made the case.
It is bizarre to me that people don't see a threat. 3,000 Americans died just September 11th. There was just a plot to blow up airplanes over the Atlantic, which would have resulted in many, many thousands of deaths. Every day, there are organizations out there plotting to kill Americans on a massive scale. And going back to Iran has initiated force against America since 1979. Systematically, repeatedly. Whether it's the 244 Marines in the barracks in Beirut, the embassy in Beirut, Cobalt Towers, etc. So we are already at war. They are trying to kill us. The question is, when will we wake up? And even Saddam Hussein, who in my list of targets is fairly low relative to a country like Iran, was still a threat to the United States. We had every moral right to go there. My condemnation is how we went there, and that it shouldn't have been number one. And if Iran had been number one and we'd done what was right, if we'd done that war properly, Saddam Hussein would have faded. He would have stopped being a threat. But to suggest that there are no threats to the United States is to take your head and bury it in the sand.
Before we take our next question, I'm going to point out that we only have about 6 minutes left and there are 5 questioners. So I'm going to ask people to keep their questions very brief, and I'm going to ask Dr. Brook to respond briefly so that we may have a chance to get through the line. We may not make it to all of you, and I apologize if that's the case. We are already running over in order to give people a chance to speak. So briefly, please.
Hello. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but my organization has actually been in contact with a lot of intelligence and military officials, and there's really no proof that America has to even connect Iraq to what happened in 9/11. So, I mean, going back, I know you spoke to some of my friends in the West Coast. You said that we should bomb 100,000 Muslims, including children, families, and men. Now, my question is, how are you going to actually bring about peace by destroying an area, killing people? Because that doesn't make sense to me.
Thank you for your question.
This is the question that I try to answer with the MacArthur quote. All I have to do, I find it bewildering, because all you have to do is point to Japan, where we killed hundreds of thousands of people in a virtuous war, in a war where we were acting in our own self-defense and they held an evil ideology, and yet today, and very quickly after World War II, the Japanese have become our allies. We have had 50 years of peace. Europe has gone through the most peaceful period in its history, probably. Certainly the freest period, Western Europe, the non-Soviet part. And I think it's because we won the war in such devastating manner during World War II. So I think the way you bring peace is you destroy evil in the name of good. And when you do that decisively, the enemy succumbs, changes its mind, and actually there's a chance for long-term, real peace to be established.
Thank you. Keep your applause down so we can get to many questions as possible. We can applaud at the end. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah.
I think your point about moral superiority is extremely important in this discussion. I think it's safe to say that Francis Marion, when he led his guerrilla fighters against the British during the Revolutionary War, believed that he was operating in a morally superior fashion. I think it's safe to say that when my father and my uncles fought in World War II against the Japanese and the Germans, they were operating in what they believed to be a morally superior fashion. I think when Menachem Begin bombed the King David Hotel, he believed he was operating in a morally superior fashion. I think when we attacked Afghanistan after 9/11, we believed we were operating in a morally superior fashion. Where was the moral superiority in attacking Iraq? There couldn't be moral superiority because, in fact, they didn't attack us. They posed no imminent threat. They had no nuclear weapons. The concept of attacking Iran is the same. They pose no imminent threat to us. They may have nuclear weapons, but they don't have the capability of getting them here. They have them to get them to Israel, but Israel outguns them probably 20 or 30 to 1. So there's no moral superiority.
I get
the question. Thank you for your comment and your question. Well,
after World War II, Japan left its emperor in power, who had blood on his hands, and it was because of American aid and because of American aid through the Marshall Plan in Europe that we have had peace.
Thank you, sir.
That is just untrue in terms of American aid or in Germany actually being the cause for the peace and the friendliness of those countries towards the United States. And just read what MacArthur had to say more extensively about Japan, and you will see that. Moral superiority. So I've already explained about Iran plenty, the fact that we're already at war with them and so on. Let me just say a few words about Iraq quickly. Again, I don't think Iraq should have been number one enemy. I don't think it should have been the number one threat. But Saddam Hussein, little things like he tried to assassinate the President of the United States. That's a threat. While it landed up that he didn't have weapons of mass destruction, He certainly could have, and all intelligence services around the world, not just the U.S., not just the CIA, but all of them, believed that he did. And there was no question about his willingness to use them. And there was a real danger that he would give it to some Islamists in order to attack the United States. He's a brutal dictator on top of that, and therefore has no right to sovereignty. Totalitarian regimes, any type of totalitarian regime, doesn't have a right to sovereignty. And then it's just an issue of, is it in America's self-interest to go and topple the totalitarian regime because it is somewhat threatening to the United States? Iraq was somewhat threatening to the United States, and we had reason to go there. Again, I don't think it was the first target. It should have been the first target. But it certainly cannot be said that it was immoral to go to war with Iraq if we would have done it right.
Next question, please.
Dr. Brook, I'm wondering a little bit about, I'm confused about the psychology involved in total defeat of the enemy. So is it the case that it's simply because the Japanese were so thoroughly defeated that they gave up their Shintoism and we can expect the same of the Islamists? Or is it because there's something about their ideology that tells them that they should be winning and then they're completely defeated?
Well, yes, I think all of these ideologies have a component that tells them that they should be winning. Indeed, this is true of Islam as well. And if you read the Islamic totalitarians, they talk about this. They talk about the fact that Islam is the religion of Allah, and Allah's on their side, and they will win. And that's a big part of their ideology, is the fact that they will win. And the reason they're losing when they lose is explained 100% in terms of the fact that they're not consistently following the ideology. That is, the excuse is always, we want good enough Muslims. By crushing them in such a way as to show them that there is no chance ever that we would let them win, that we are indeed confident in our Western values, that we are superior to them culturally, militarily, and that we will stand up to them in every sense. We are not just defeating them in the sense that we can't win, but we're defeating this fundamental aspect of their ideology. They now have to question whether Allah is on their side, and maybe, hopefully, question his very existence. Not that I'm saying that they'll convert to atheism, but they need to, it really challenges them. If you know, they have to then question the whole system of belief and come up with a new ideology, or just create the vacuum as described in Japan, which I think is what happens. And then it's a question of what fills it. And I think one of the advantages of creating a vacuum is that you are then in a position to fill it. Not fill it, sacrificially, but fill it with the true ideology of freedom that you are advocating for, that you can then present them with, just like, although done imperfectly, just like MacArthur did in Japan. And again, if you go read the Japanese Constitution, it's not ideal, but it ain't bad. It's as good as any constitution a Western country has out there. And in the Constitution, it actually has a line that says that the Japanese people, in the Constitution, that the Japanese people have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the kind of ideas you need to bring into that vacuum. And when you do, they'll be open to them, because Islam and their version of Islam would have been completely discredited. Allah is not on their side anymore.
We're going to need to keep this very, very brief because we are now out of time, but I'm going to try to get these last two questions in if we can. But I'm going to cut you off very quickly if it goes on. I apologize.
Sure. Just real quick. You had identified your disagreement with the Bush administration repeatedly. But my concern is that I know you've been doing a lot of speaking recently around the country, and what I fear is that because it's congruent with what the Bush administration is saying on Iran and the drumbeat toward Iran, which many in the military are upset about, my fear is that this is going to be perceived, because this is what some people, I wouldn't want you to prove what LaRouche is saying right, that you're a prostitute for the Lynn and Dick Cheney.
You need to end this up, please.
I want to actually make sure, my suggestion, and I want to know if you're going to reply to this, is if you can actually cut off your speaking engagements around the country so as not to be perceived as creating a climate of fear around Iran
Let me just say, let me just make this point about Iran and my connection to the Bush administration or Lynn Cheney or whoever. 3 weeks after September 11th, the Ayn Rand Institute put a full-page ad in the New York Times and the Washington Post, and you can go find it. Well before anybody in the administration or outside of the administration was talking about Iran, our full-page ad said that the number one target in this war, before Afghanistan even, should be Iran. So this has been our issue from day one. And to suggest it just shows, I obviously haven't been visible enough, but I've been on the speaking tour since, immediately after September 11th, since January of 2002, and have not stopped and don't intend to stop and will never stop as long.
Okay. On both sides, everybody hold on. We have one last question. Thank you. Please ask me. Sir, you've been waiting very patiently. Please go ahead and ask your question, but make it brief as she's escorted out.
Excuse me. I wonder if there's a possibility that Bush's motivation may not necessarily be altruistic, but might be coming from his involvement as an agent of the New World Order globalist. And I wonder if it also could be your critical attitude towards religion might have led you to ignore that factor.
Thank you, sir.
Let me just say, if you're interested in conspiracy theories, I recommend Daniel Pipe's book, where he shows how ridiculous they are, that he wrote, I think, in 1997. Look, I've given you the quotes. I don't think I think that Bush is quite clear about his agenda. I don't think there's any secrets here. I don't think it's mysterious. We can argue about interpreting Bush's statements, but there's no global conspiracy here. There's no global anything. There is a U.S. foreign policy that, in my view, is wrong, is corrupt, and that needs to be changed. And I think I've articulated a framework for a new foreign policy which needs to be adopted by this country if we want to win and if we want to thrive in the future. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.